The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A., and with me today is Sarah Gilman. Sarah Gilman studied studio art and biology in college and wasn't quite satisfied with either. The art world looked hermetic, sealed off in cities away from the landscapes that she loved, and the science world felt binding too, with its sprint to publish clunky treatises for an audience of other scientists. Writing, though, stole the best from both fields: the creativity, the exploring, the analysis, and the always and forever learning. And at its best, seemed like it could bring the same important topics explored by art and science to a much broader audience of people. So here she is, still at writing. Sarah writes about the environment, energy, science, and miscellany from Mazama, Washington. She was a staff and contributing editor for High Country News, an environmental magazine about the American West, for 11 years, and is a contributing editor for both Biographic Magazine and Hakai Magazine. Sarah Gilman, welcome.
Hi, Len. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I have been, since seeing the first article of yours that I ever saw, which was on lichen, that was published in Yes Magazine, I've now expanded and read a lot of your articles and really love your writing, your perspective, and especially your poetry and your illustrations. I don't mean any insult to your scientific writing, but as an artist, you are amazing. And I wondered if you would be willing first to talk a little bit about your process in combining art with your writing.
Yeah, and introduced, I am a little bit of a mush person, a creative mush person, I would say. I have a background in a bunch of different things. And when I got into realize that art was going to be a part of my professional life again, until a friend of mine who will probably be a little less familiar to West Coast readers, but Craig Childs, he's a Southwest writer on the Four Corners. He invited me to illustrate his book about how essentially the peopling of the Americas, like how and where people may have ended up here and when, and different about that. And we had this really fun collaboration where he kind of gave me about 20 ideas he was super interested in having illustrated. And we went back and forth about those ideas, and then I would give him sketches and then finished drawings. And from that, we came up with about 20 that are in the book Atlas of a Lost World, which came out, I think, in maybe 2016 or 20. After that sort of assignment, I guess you'd call it an assignment, is more like a handshake agreement. I realized I could bring my own art into my own writing. And so I started to look for stories that did a nice job kind of combining both. And usually they had a really sort of strong unifying idea behind them. Per se, it has more to do with like kind of the grand thematic backdrop of a story, like the big driving idea, and whether it had sort of compelling things about it that could be communicated visually. So, for example, 2018, I reported and wrote a story for the Atlantic magazine series Life Up Close in Chile in the Atacama Desert about this little tiny seabird that spends all its life over 300 miles from the coast, essentially. It just lives over the water. It flies everywhere. It's related to albatross, which, wandering albatross, they do the same thing. But then when it came time to fly inland, 50 to 60 miles and lay its egg in a hole in the Atacama Desert, which is incredibly barren looking. Very, very little places are alive, but it's hard to see if it's not the right conditions. And so this bird was essentially splitting its time, its life between these sort of what were functionally visually two seas, a sea of sand and rock. And I was very compelled by that idea about this tiny, delicate little thing splitting its life between these completely extreme environments that had these visuals also very different. And so when I can find an idea like that for a big feature like that one for the Atlantic, then I pitch it as both a writing and an art project. It's a little magazine stuff that I do. So the article that you came across that first brought you to me is the latest of a quarterly column series I do for Yes about points of ecological resilience as an antidote to doom feelings. Having been an environmental journalist for a very long time, at this point now, coming up on 20 years, start to just feel like everything is really bad news. And most of the way that those stories are getting framed is about disaster and all the things that are wrong. And it just starts to seem like maybe we also need to talk about the ways that everything is still alive. And so with that column, I really try to think about what in the natural world do I know about or that I've come across in my reporting that both would be really and would work in the format of a 4-page sequence, which is how long the column is in each issue. And that will also get at that larger idea of resilience within the theme that the issue is doing. The one that the lichen appeared in was connection. One about endings. I did whale fall, which is when a whale sinks to the bottom of the ocean when it dies, and they become essentially their whole own ecosystem. So the ending of their life is actually the beginning of many other lives. I'm sort of looking at that both in literal form and also metaphorically in terms of both living and dead whales support other beings, both with the nutrients they disperse throughout the ocean by pooping, essentially, and stirring up the soil, the sediment on the bottom of the ocean, eating people who whale. A lot of indigenous people in the far north still hunt whales, and animals that might scavenge whale carcasses, and of course the deep sea creatures falling onto the bottom where there's almost no other food besides what falls from the surface to the deep.
Right. I've heard that referred to as trophic cascade, like that by
Yeah.
the role of many of the what we consider sort of top predators or largest mammals, as the case may be, in the environment is essentially keeping everything cycling through the cycles of that particular ecosystem, and there's been a great documentation of that, as you noted, for whales, also for wolves and other predators, and it is very affirming, to think about how beautifully nature has put itself together to keep all that moving. And, unfortunately, we're doing this on radio, and I can't share any of your illustrations, but you do beautiful illustrations. And I was wondering if you would be willing to read all or part of this piece you did on lichen, because I found it I did not know hardly anything about lichen before, except I did know it was a symbiotic relationship, but that was about it. And this I found really beautiful and educational in terms of how you described it in such accessible language.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I fell in love with lichens in biology in college. You learn about, I had no idea, I don't think before then, that they were two free living organisms that had become sort of one over the process of time. The ability to live in places they would never be able to persist on their own. And it's kind of the classic example that biology professors like to throw at students to teach them what a mutualistic symbiosis looks like, where two organisms can't really thrive without one another. Each helps the other. So the column is called Terra Firma, where my editor is very clever and she came up with that. Um, and the title of this one is Separate and Inseparable. They root in stone and drape the bark of trees, fill gaps between tundra tussocks, stabilize wind-scoured sand, and spread across gravestones and weathered bones. They come in beards, in tendrils, in bubbly and scabby crusts, in frilly, freckled, and hair-edged petals, in branches and brittle antlers, in bouquets of snorkels and tiny goblets. In parts of the Arctic, they tangle into mats up to 3 feet thick, pillowing your step, peeling off of rocks in domes like improbable hats. We call their species, some 20,000 of which have been described so far, things like witch's hair, bloody comma, surprise, vagabond, beret, fire dot, pixie cup, and lobed nipple. We say that they are star-tipped and black-footed, that they are powdered sunshine and yellow soot and pink earth. They joined hands 250 million years ago, partners spinning to a dance that made them one being. A primary fungus meshed with an alga or cyanobacterium, or both at once. We call this union lichen. The alga makes sugars from carbon dioxide and sunlight, which it shares with the fungus. The cyanobacterium does this too, and also fixes airborne nitrogen into usable forms, key for making proteins. The fungus provides a home, using the sugars to build the lichen's body around its participants, and storing some in reservoirs as sugar alcohol, which may help it resist long dry periods. The fungus also sponges moisture, nutrients, and minerals from air, dew, fog, and rainfall, and keeps out harmful ultraviolet radiation. This collaboration allows lichens to grow without soil in places their constituent parts could never survive alone. Lichens can endure the vacuum of space. They can live in the dry valleys of Antarctica, where temperatures drop to negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and in deserts where temperatures surpass 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Their slow growth marks the passage of time beyond human memory. They draw centuries-old maps over boulders. They fur and blur the edges of still-standing rock cairns and blinds that caribou hunters stacked thousands of years ago in western Alaska. This is just one of the many ways that lichens' gifts extend beyond their own skins. Oh, sorry, I'm going to read that one again. This is just one of the many This is just one of the many ways that lichens' gifts extend beyond their own skins into broader webs of connection. In the north, caribou and muskoxen rely on lichen to get them through the harsh, dark blow of winter, and their bodies in turn feed bears and wolves and people, helping each live in a place where survival might otherwise be out of reach. In the inland Pacific Northwest, lichens feed flying squirrels during the colder months, and the squirrels stay on through the warmer seasons to feast on mushrooms whose spores, once passed through the squirrels, root a fungal network that helps trees draw all that they need from the soil. But one of lichen's strengths also makes them vulnerable. As sponges, they absorb indiscriminately, taking up not only nutrients but also deadly exhaust from our cars and industry, metals from our mining dust, radioactive material from our atomic bomb tests. And climate change is warming the Arctic, allowing shrubs to root in places they never could before, blocking the sun that lichens need in order to make food, slowly whittling them away and threatening all that they sustain. Their plight is ours, but we would do well to remember that their dance is as well. We're all lichens, as lichenologist Peter Neitlich puts it, from the microorganisms that live on and inside of our bodies and help us digest and fight illness, to the animals and plants we depend on for food, shelter, and clean air and water. Everything alive thrives only in interdependence. We are separate, yes, but we are also inseparable.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, my guest is Sarah Gilman. She's an environmental writer and an illustrator and a poet. amazing how lichens spring up in so many environments and play such a critical and ecological role. And I'm always struck, when I'm out in the forests around here on the Central Coast, of all the different forms it takes. Have you been able to apply what you learned about lichens when you wander in the Cascades in Washington where you live?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that a lot of what I knew about lichen I knew before I wrote the piece. And so one of the things I first noticed, things that Peter Neitlich, the lichenologist that I spoke with, also noticed, he lives here in the Methow Valley where I live, actually, is that the dry side forests on the east slope of the Washington Cast tons and tons and tons of wolf lichen, which is this fluorescent green, kind of like tendrily, crunchy, branchy stuff that just comes and bark of a lot of the conifers that grow here and add this really big pop of color. And then when we have windstorms, it ends up in pieces all over the ground. It's really striking
Pink.
in the sense that it's easier to see them when you know what they are, when you know what they do, they kind of pop out in the landscape and where you might they might otherwise blend into the back.
Yeah, and where they really blend in, I learned when I was traveling in the desert Southwest that the soil in many places is actually held together by a type of lichen, and it forms a sort of a crust. And if you just see it, if you're standing there
Yeah.
looking out upon it, you think, oh, it's dirt. And but if you walk on it, it actually breaks it, and can take decades literally to recover from that. Are there some more other unusual forms of lichen that you've been entranced by?
Well, I want to say something else about those critters you just named. I'm from Colorado originally, and the way that people use the desert in Utah in particular and in the Four Corners area that they graze cattle, the way that where they walk, where they ride ORVs or motorbikes or drive, as that crust gets busted up across the southwestern deserts, they end up blowing red dust all over the snowpack and the Rockies. And that in turn it reduces the albedo on the snow, which is albedo is big. And so when snow is white, it reflects the sun's energy and it doesn't melt as fast. But when it's dark, it absorbs it much quicker. And so there's a measurable decrease in snow and increase in the rate of snow melt related to, you just mentioned, getting destroyed and sending all of this dust that they stabilize into the Rockies. So just another example of that interconnection that's so important, where this tiny, tiny little thing actually plays a very, very large. People in Colorado and ecosystems in Colorado have adequate water coming out of the mountains in the summertime as that snowpack melts.
So you wrote an article recently about Big Basin State Park, which is right here in our neighborhood, and about the rebuilding of the park after the fire, and trying to do that with both wildlife and future fires in mind. And I wonder if you could talk about what you found, and if you care to read any part of that article that you wrote.
Yeah, absolutely. And that article sort of originated from some buzz on a very nerdy listserv called the North Pacific or the Pacific Seabird Group that Audubon sort of monitors. About basically it's all the bird scientists and folks, big conference about seabird biology every year talking about seabirds. And there was a bunch of buzz there about whether the CZU complex fire that burned 87 and most of the landscape inside of Big Basin State Park had essentially really harmed the marbled murrelet population place. And so marbled murrelets are a seabird that nests up in the branches of some very tall trees inland, sort of like the stern petrel I mentioned earlier, earlier and made them pretty vulnerable to logging and development. And so in the lower 48, they were listed as endangered in 1992. And there is a population of marbled murrelets that has managed to hang on as far south as Santa Cruz and Big Basin State Park, because Big Basin has managed to sort of protect an island of really good old growth redwood habitat, while clear cutting was proceeding outside early 20th century. And when the fire burned through, biologists were really worried that those murrelets had lost the last of like some of their most important habitat in that region. And they were poorly because the recreation in Big Basin, it brings a lot of people. About 1 million people were going to the park per year, and they picnic in the old growth redwoods, and the food that they were eating was attracting jays and crows and ravens, and those birds are nest predators for marbled murrelets. And it actually seems that those birds were, with this human food subsidy, were actually becoming a primary cause of decline for this population of marbled murrelets in Big Basin Redwood State Park. And though there was a lot of concern, and there's a lot of concern about how this fire was going to affect these endangered birds, the marbled murrelet, there was also a thought that because it burns all of the infrastructure, it actually gave managers an opportunity to rethink where and how people could recreate in the park in ways that would protect marbled murrelets and also old growth redwoods, so that some of these impacts of heavy human use be moved or changed in such a way that the animals and plants in the park could do better, which will become more and more important with climate change putting pressure on these protected areas at the same time as visitation goes up, like the pandemic and more people wanting to go outside. And so this was an opportunity to kind of write about both how the fire affected the park and those birds, and also how there might be an opportunity inside of this tragedy, make it better in the future for conservation. And so hopefully that's enough background to understand the section I'd like to read. And just a little precursor to this. So I explained about the marbled murrelets doing poorly in the park prior to the fire. And one of the things they've done to figure out how they're doing is set up a long-term monitoring program through audio-visual surveys. So that's where we begin here. Summer is a sleepless season for people who study birds. The weekly audio-visual survey starts 45 minutes before sunrise on July 8th, 2021. That's 5:12 a.m. Portia Halbert has been up for 2 hours when she begins to scan the sky at her site, a dirt lot surrounded by thick forest in Portola Redwood State Park, just north of Big Basin. The first sounds are the yelling of an American robin and the laugh track of acorn woodpeckers. Then a high, clear note cuts through the marine fog above. Keer! There, Halbert says. She notes into her tape recorder a murrelet bound inland, as she will all other murrelet activity she witnesses over the next 2 hours. Surveyors at three other state parks in Santa Cruz Mountains will do the same. There is lots to listen to besides Keer's. There's a groan call that is a cross between a creaking door and a kazoo. There's the woof, woof, woof of wing beats under the canopy, which is a sign of a nest nearby. Soon, murrelets are traversing the gap of sky above our heads in pairs and groups, constellations of flight and song. Social hour, Halbert calls it. Before the 2021 breeding season, Halbert predicted that murrelets would flock to Portola's unburned forests and abandon severely burned habitat in Big Basin and elsewhere. Indeed, Portola is humming, but Big Basin is humming too, averaging about 50 murrelet detections per visit, higher than before the fire. In fact, detections at all sites are the second highest in recent years. I was straight wrong when it came to assessing the likelihood of birds coming to use the habitat, she says. And there is more to be upbeat about. That afternoon, Halbert sets up a spotting scope in a ruined Big Basin picnic area. Through its aperture is a branch flexed like a bodybuilder's arm in a still green Douglas fir. where a sunbeam spotlights a fuzzy, motionless ball tucked against the trunk. A week earlier, consulting biologist Alex Rinkert saw a murrelet fly low to this place with fish in its bill. He staked out the location until he was certain. The bird was feeding a chick. Amid the devastation, Rinkert had discovered a nest. The chick doesn't look like much on our first visit, but when we meet Rinkert there the following day, we find it plucking away at its down, wisps of which drift through the scorching air like lost snowflakes. The sleek head that has emerged is capped with gray, the throat cream-colored, the bulgy eyes white-lidded and sleepy. Somehow, in 2 days, this creature has sculpted itself from lump into bird, preening into smoothness, stretching inert limbs into wings and beating them into life. It's ready to go, Rinkert whispers, on its long solo journey west to the sea. Watching it, it's easy to feel a sense of rebirth, despite the soot that smears our faces and cuffs. Already, tall green shoots explode from the bases of charred redwoods. Others are covered with fuzzy green foliage, sprouts spurred by disturbance, a phenomenon that arborists call poodling. Waxy ceanothus shrubs decorate the ground, along with coyote brush, yerba santa, and other fire-following plants that were scarce before the burn. By a creek where flames have burned away needles, scarified seeds, and opened the canopy with blinding sun, thousands of finger-sized redwood seedlings rise from the ground. Even Tim Hyland, a Santa Cruz District environmental scientist who focuses on plants, has never seen that here before. The dense foliage had prevented it. The forest will not be a vaulted green cathedral again for a generation, but it's still very much alive, becoming something new.
I love that you found that thread again of renewal in this account of what's going on there, and that's seems to be a thread in so much of your work, that you're finding the ways that nature is able to rebound and regenerate. And I wondered, I think in some ways some of your poetry addresses that too, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about regeneration and how that applies to human life as well.
Yeah. I mean, I talked a little bit about in the beginning of our discussion about how much of environmental journalism and writing is about all the harm in the world. And I think it can make it very hard to see all the ways in which the world is, as an entire whole living system made up of all kinds of beings, is dynamic and unpredictable and resilient. And I think in order, one, to sustain energy in fighting for what is alive and for living systems, it's important to remember that in the midst of the sixth great extinction, there's also a lot we don't know, how different animals and plants and even people are going to respond to change, and to look at the way the world moves, to remember that it is incredibly powerful in ways that we do not yet know how to see, both as a mechanism for hope and also for humility, because as powerful as we are, the world will survive us. It'll just be different. And whether we want the ways it's different, I think, is the real question here. Like, where do we want to live, and what beings do we want to live alongside? And recognizing the ways that it moves can help us understand that our task isn't to save the world, it's to be a more responsible part of it. And so I guess in terms of human life, it's pretty easy to see, looking at a burned landscape and seeing regeneration and thinking about the individual disasters any of us go through. And, if you lose a loved one, or your place is completely upended and changing because of an environmental disaster, there are ways to heal and go on. And I think remembering that that's possible is, it's such a fundamental part of being alive. Organisms are incredibly powerful and resilient, and every living thing essentially is working to survive at every given moment. And in some ways that's kind of weird and horror story and scary, and in other ways it's a huge relief to know that life has this force and it exists within all of us, no matter what we're dealing with.
And we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with more with Sarah Gilman right after this short message. If you're just joining us, my guest is Sarah Gilman. She is an environmental writer, an illustrator, and a poet. And Sarah, you've traveled so much for a lot of the writing that you do, and you witness people in different places. I read an article you wrote about a woman named Eileen, who lives in the desert not far from Moab in a place called Cisco, Utah, and kind of an exemplary thing of someone really kind of on what we might call the edge of modern civilization, but really resourceful in creating and nurturing the life around her, and creating a new life for herself. And I thought you did a wonderful job of both illustrating it in your drawings, and also in your paintings, and also in the way you described the situation and had your interactions with her. And I really appreciated that. And if you feel inclined to read any of that, I'd certainly welcome it. But if not, I'd love to get into some of your poetry.
Yeah, I didn't plan a reading from that one, but I found it super compelling too, just as a person in my 30s reporting that and trying to figure out how to afford a life in the United States as it exists now, and it's so expensive and hard. And the backstory on that for others who are interested in that story is Eileen is an artist from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who ended up buying part of a ghost town. You may have seen it in Thelma and Louise. The car chase passes through it. Several other films have been filmed there over the years, and I think even that the new show Fallout might have some scenes filmed in Cisco. Eileen might even be in that show. I'm not sure. I haven't watched it, but yeah, I think especially for young people trying to figure out how to live in the world that's unaffordable and difficult and out of reach. This person who found a space for herself and sort of the in-between, in a place that nobody seemed to want, like that she could make a world for herself inside of that spot. And it's a good reminder that no place, there's this tendency in our culture to look at what we think of as empty spaces as these sort of wastelands where it's not worth being. And there's no place that really is a wasteland. Everything contains something beautiful, something alive, and Eileen is proof that also you can carry that with you wherever you go and create it where you go. And I love spending time with her because of that. So yeah, if you want to read that one, it's called Pioneer of Ruin. That's one of my favorite things I've ever done, and it's best read with the illustration. So we'll let you do that one.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm forgetting right now, where was that published?
That was published in High Country News, which is a great magazine about the American West, published out of Colorado, but covering the whole Rocky Mountain West and sometimes the Dakotas and Oklahoma and Alaska.
Great. Sarah, you mentioned early in our conversation that you had collaborated on this book that I think it's called Atlas of a Lost World. Is that the right title?
Yeah, I was the illustrator for Craig Childs on that book. Yeah.
Yeah. And did that, you mentioned it was, about how people came to America. Was that including the indigenous people who predate the Europeans and others who came
yeah,
in?
It was entirely about the first peoples of North America,
right.
and competing stories about how they got to different places and how long they've been here, both their own and also archaeology. And there's, I think the date identified by archaeologists keeps getting pushed back in different places. I think it's past 20,000 years now, and there are some theories about people showing up simultaneously, I believe, in North and South America. And so it covers a lot of that, and also his own sort of explorations of the region to try to understand the relationship that people have built inside of this place over tens of thousands and tens of thousands of years in time immemorial.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about that, like to actually have, in a be inhabiting a space for that long continuously. And one comment I read from an indigenous woman, Lila June, was she was saying all these people who arrived to colonize the Americas were coming out of incredibly traumatized situations themselves, and she attributes a lot of the destructive behavior to that fact that people were coming out of very traumatic circumstances. And yet somewhere back there, even for those of us who are descended or primarily descended from people from, say, Europe or Central Asia, it's somewhere back there, our ancestors also had continuous habitation in one place for a very long time before they started moving. And in often cases, the times when people do move is because there's some threat coming at them from one direction or another. So it's amazing to see how that evolves. And so I wondered if collaborating on that book, Atlas of a Lost World, if there was anything in particular in there that struck a chord for you in terms of your understanding of where you'd like to see yourself and the people that are part of your community survive and have a more, let's say, a more nurturing presence on the planet.
That is a question I cannot answer. I don't know. I don't actually have that particular relationship with that book, and it's been so long since I read it that I would be really casting about and pulling straws from nowhere to try to answer.
That's fine. Yeah, if I don't ask at least one question that's unanswerable, I'm not really doing my job.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I'm happy to have you just candidly tell me exactly how you responded to that. But I really would love to have you share some poetry, and I'll let you pick. But I have been seeing more and more of it, and appreciating it pretty universally, which I can't say for every poet that I've read. So,
thanks. And so just a precursor so I do this thing I would call comics poetry, which is a union of drawing and writing where the images and the texts interact with each other. I get one of the most popular poets who does something like this is Rupi Kaur, but I kind of got clued into it at a big conference for MFAs, which I am not one, but there was a cool conference on comics poetry there, and I've been experimenting with it ever since. And along the lines of what I was talking about with the idea that there really are no wastelands or dead space in the world is alive kind of wherever you look. This kind of deals with that in some ways. It's called The Lady of the Lake. In March, I moved into a house overlooking my small town sewage lagoon. I joke that I have lakefront property, call it the lake house, which I guess makes me the lady of the lake. But I have never lived on the water before, and my little house on its wedge of weedy earth between square ponds and bending cottonwoods and the river pressing its banks is always at the center of a whirl of birds. Geese wing whistle around the eaves, roost in rows on the pond access road, watch me and my dog through the fence. Someone nailed a wash basin high in a tree, and one nests there too, its head a strange periscope from a tin ship, spying. Ravens neck on the pond's banks, and ducks cut trails through the algae, and red-winged blackbirds shout over each evening's frogs, and nighthawks boom over them all. One morning from the living room window, I watch a blackbird tenderly feed some wriggling thing to a brown bird among the dandelions. They eat grass seeds I throw. They eat elm seeds the wind throws. They eat God knows what in the ponds. And when the first bugs hatch, swallows turn air into motion, spinning past the windows information, in cross paths, in collisions. They chat on the power line, making their robotic beep boop sounds, or jitter in a row atop the cooler I left on the porch, staring at me, staring at them, drinking my second cup of coffee, the lady of the lake.
I love that that sense of the birds looking back at you, like, which they do, but so often
Oh, yeah.
it's so easy to walk by and kind of ignore them. But it's when you're tuned in, it's fascinating how much time other creatures spend observing us.
Yeah. Well, and this particular place is so interesting because it's the settling ponds for the sewage system in Winthrop, Washington, which is a town of 500 people, and it's two square ponds and one triangular pond, and the sewage settles in the ponds next to my house, and then it gets cleaner in the next pond and the next pond, and somehow it doesn't smell. And there is an enormous amount of activity around it in terms of the living things that like it. Because of the aerators, it's often not frozen in winter, so it has a ton of birds, the ones that stick around. And in the summer, for whatever reason, it still has a ton of birds. And I was walking my dog the other day on the path that goes around, and this bald eagle was flying up the river corridor because the river goes right along the side of the sewage lagoon. And I watched it, and then as I was watching it, it like stooped into a really steep dive, and it dove into the sewage lagoon.
Wow.
and tried to pick something up. And I think it might have been a big piece of cardboard that was floating on the surface. And it realized after it grabbed this thing that it was not a fish. And you know when you watch a person pick up something that they thought was something else and then realize it's really disgusting, and they're like, ugh! And they like open their hands and like flinch. It sort of did that with its talons and then flew away. Like, if you can imagine a bald eagle looking sheepish, and I know I'm anthropomorphizing now, but it looks so embarrassed and kind of dirty.
Yeah.
It was like it dove into the duckweedy ponds after that, not fish. And yeah, I have yet to see a bald eagle do anything majestic with a fish. Mostly I've seen them try to steal fish from osprey, and mostly result in the fish being lost back in the river. So this kind of fit that whole mold, but it was a wild thing to see. I've never seen anything like that before.
No kidding.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of how cats, if they trip over something and actually stumble, which is not that common. They're pretty graceful usually.
Yeah.
How they get this certain look on their face, like, you didn't see that. I didn't do that. It's like,
Yeah.
they do not want to acknowledge if they did anything awkward or, goofy looking. It's
Yeah.
Well, I love that. If you're just joining us, my guest is Sarah Gilman. She's an environmental writer and an illustrator and a poet.
I have this fantasy about writing sort of a nature writing, not a critique, but something that bends the conventions of nature writing to be sort of like a Walden style meditation on living on a sewage lagoon. Yeah. Which is maybe the nerdiest thing anybody's ever do. But, yeah.
But so apropos for our times.
Yeah, exactly.
You wrote another one called "What Water Gives," and I wondered if you would read that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is about, it was inspired by a river trip I took with some friends last year to the Yampa River in Colorado, which is this amazing damless wild river that passes through Dinosaur National Park. And when I went, I was in a really serious car wreck last May where someone got pretty hurt, and it was traumatic for everybody involved. And I went on this trip right afterwards. And so it is a bit about that, although that's a subtext that you might not be able to hear in the words. So it's called What Water Gives. I drove toward the rain and the cool as if it was a country I could arrive in. Idaho, then Utah, then Colorado, then the river. In that desert, Sage and sky looked so blue against red soil that I mistook the buzz of crickets for the sound of one color singing off another. Monsoons painted the cliffs and chilled my shoulders until the rapids climbing into my lap over the raft's bow felt warm as skin. Each night, cracked open by silence and dark, I dreamt nameless things under named stars. A dead mountain lion lay among the reeds of the river bank, strange as any night. Only its claws, white and scimitar and perfect, had the sharpness of memory. When I stood in the current, sand whispered around my ankles, hips, hands. Water carves a body as sure as it has any stone. Would I be oxbow or tower or overhang or alcove? It is important to remember that vacancy is a story too. Each absence reveals the presence of movement. Sometimes to go home, you leave home. You move towards your heart as if it is a country you can arrive in, because it is.
Moving towards our heart as a country we can arrive in. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm just repeating it so I can hold it in myself. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
And both of those poems appeared in Last Word on Nothing, which I gather you're a fairly regular contributor to. Is that also a print medium, or is it only online?
It's only online. It's basically a hobby blog maintained by a bunch of science writers, and Craig Childs, actually, who invited me to illustrate his book, is the one who's also a participant who invited me to be on the blog as well. And it's been it's not paid. It's just we each do a post each month. And in the course of my career freelancing, I left High Country News as an editor to become a freelancer in 2014. The Last Word on Nothing has been basically where I've developed my combined writing, drawing, voice in a low pressure creative space where I can just play. And I feel like that doing that there is what has opened up my eyes to all the possibilities combining those media and just having it as a spot to reach out to people with both of those at the same time and experiment without any stakes. Like, nobody is going to tell me it's good or bad. I can publish whatever I want. And so, yeah, I actually think that is one of the reasons why Yes asked me to do the Terra Firma column, is because I've been kind of messing around with this for a little while in a way that has really helped me grow. So I'm really grateful to be a part of that community and that platform. Yeah,
and I the way you combine your illustrations and the hand lettering of the poetry within it is to me is fairly unique, and I'm really appreciating that. So
thank you.
It's a whole new discovery for me. There's another poem I read of yours which I loved, called "The Physics of Melt," and if you have that on hand, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. All right. Snow is blank only briefly, just after it falls. Then pass coyote, deer, rabbit, you, me, and the sun melts our tracks into braided cups. Or rain carves runnels that join in intricate fans, deltas without water. Or freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw make soft piles into brittle fins of ice. Or heat lingers and bends snow's smooth plain into a rolling terrain of mounds and dips, a union that reveals the nature of the ground below. I think desire can be that way too. What you want is different once you get it, but what sets you alight also shows you your shape.
Yeah, we shape and we are shaped constantly. Yeah. Well, that's brilliant. Well, Sarah, I want to make sure you tell people how to find more of your writing, and if there's
Yeah.
anything else you'd like to share before we end, we have, a few minutes left. There's no rush, but I wanted to make sure, at least before you go, that you share how people can find more of your work.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm afraid I'm incredibly delinquent at keeping my writing webpage updated, but I'm a regular contributor at Hakai magazine, Hakai. I also write for Audubon and have written for Atlantic, and High Country News has an enormous amount of my work in their archives from my 11 years working for them as a staff and contributing editor. And then you can find my comics poetry at thelastwordonnothing.com, as we've just been reading it out loud. And then if you want to follow my illustration life, you can find me on Instagram at Hidden Drawer Designs, like hidden drawer as in a drawer you pull out of a dresser, and designs like, designs. And that is where I regularly post my illustrations from various magazines and also from my own writing and poetry. And then I also sell prints of my illustrations on Etsy, also under Hidden Drawer Designs. So Etsy, Hidden Drawer Designs is where you can find my artwork pretty reliably updated. And I guess last, I'm just really appreciative that people are excited to kind of jump into a weird mush of writing and art that, I don't know, maybe helps us all remember this powerful place that we're a part of, and how dynamic and spectacular living things and living systems are. And I don't know, every day you get to come into contact with the profound through all of the other living things that we share the world with. So I hope that my work helps people remember and see that in their everyday lives, and also become better citizens of a world that includes more than just people.
Sarah Gilman, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the program, and I look forward to following your creative work in the future.
Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me, Len. I really appreciate it.